Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Stories from the week ending December 16, 2023. We begin with a story from Reuters that a U.S. judge has ruled, or at least a magistrate has ruled, that Elon Musk must cooperate with the latest SEC probe, and he must testify again around his $44 billion takeover of the company formerly known as Twitter. The U.S. Magistrate Beeler quickly rejected arguments by Musk's attorneys that the SEC does not have authority to issue subpoenas, which is about the most inane argument I think you can make, but typical of Musk's lawyers. Next up, in a very significant development, Congress has passed a new anti-bribery law for the 21st century. It is entitled the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, and our story comes to us from Transparency International. The bill would make it a crime for a foreign official to demand or accept a bribe from a U.S. company, or demand or accept any bribe that substantially impacts U.S. commerce. This is a huge step forward. Obviously, the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, is a supply-side law only making illegal companies that pay bribes. And here we have a bill to make a quid pro quo on the other side. Now, whether the U.S. can get jurisdiction over these foreign officials, obviously that's an open question, but it's a big step forward. Next up, a story from The Pillar, a first-time contributor to this podcast, reports that the Pope Francis met with officials from the staff of the Auditor General Office from the Vatican and said that there must be merciful discretion when dealing with cases of corruption and balance that need with absolute transparency. So I'm not quite sure what merciful discretion means, whether it means you allow the wrongdoers to be mercifully forgiven, but it seems like a very inauspicious start to a pretty serious matter, which is an audit of Vatican finances. The Vatican has been rife with corruption allegations over the past several years, and this is a much-needed step for transparency. But when the Pope says be discreet, well, we'll see if they're discreet. Next up, from the U.S. State Department, reports that, with a press release, it's leveraging tools to promote accountability and counter global corruption. On the occasion of International Anti-Corruption Day, the U.S. is taking the following actions to promote accountability for corrupt actors. They designated over 30 individuals as specially designated individuals, building upon the Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, and where there's credible information of foreign officials have been involved in corruption, they will be ineligible for entry into the United States. So no Disney World for you. I can't think of a much bigger sanction on a corrupt Russian. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Richard Vandeford reporting that once again, the United States Department of Justice has been required to defend its use of NPAs and DPAs. Nicole Argentieri, acting Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, said the use of settlements was an important tool in the government's quiver They are serious agreements that are highly negotiated, and they require a forward-looking change by the company. They are not a pass. Obviously, questioning around these has been something that's been going on for many, many years, and the DOJ has had to defend their apparent leniency. Of course, we don't know all of the facts which go into individual DPAs and MPAs, and multiple factors do, particularly including self-disclosure, cooperation, remediation, and of course all of that going forward. So it depends on what you're trying to do. Are you trying to spank and punish? Are you trying to change behavior? What incentives are you putting in place for companies to self-disclose? All of these factors go into a resolution, and right now those resolutions are largely NPAs and DPAs. Next up, the second of two stories this week from the Wall Street Journal, this time from the oil and energy section. BP, the company formerly known as British Petroleum, has docked former CEO Bernard Looney as much as $40 million over, quote, serious misconduct, end quote. The serious misconduct was him lying to the board about past relationships with colleagues. This includes maximum potential value of salary, pension payments, deferred bonuses, and other compensation he might have received. The board concluded that he had made, quote, misleading assurances about his past relationships that were, quote, inaccurate and incomplete. Sounds like lying to me. A spokesman for Looney did not respond to a request for comment. He had told the company's board in September he had not been fully transparent. So, guys, don't sleep with the coworkers. If you do, don't lie to the board about it. Next up from Reuters, a report of a FCPA settlement as Freeport Commodities has agreed to pay $98 million to settle charges of a corruption scheme to misappropriate material non-public information from Brazilian officials around Petrobras. Obviously, Petrobras scandal has rocked literally across the globe. The commodity traders are finally getting their due. They thought they were exempt or weren't going to be covered by the FCPA literally for years, and it turns out, of course, that's not true. Particularly when you think about commodity traders in energy outside the United States, energy companies are all state-owned enterprise. So if you get non-material public information, that's not only a potential antitrust or anti-competitive violation, but it's also an FCPA violation. So if you're a trading company and you haven't looked into this issue, you better do it because the DOJ is coming for you. Next up from Bloomberg, think corruption is taken too lightly in the United States? Well, in China, a ex-Bank of China manager was jailed for life over a $322 million fraud. It handed down a life sentence to a Zhao Jing, a former bank manager who was repatriated from the U.S. to China 2 years ago. He was convicted of fraud and embezzlement and misappropriation. He took advantage of loopholes at the lender and made fraudulent loans, which he kept. His accomplices received 12 to 13-year sentences, but he got the big one, life. And our final story comes to us from the Financial Times, and it is, of course, the ongoing saga of Wirecard. And the former CFO of Wirecard has finally been charged with fraud. Munich prosecutors charged Burkhard Ley, who was a CFO from 2006 to 2017, with fraud in his role in the collapse of the former high-flying German payments firm. This will be our final 10 for 10 for 2023. I'd like to wish everyone a great holiday season, and we look forward to visiting with you again in 2024. Thanks for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. As I mentioned in a prior episode, this is the one request I've received most often from podcast listeners of the Daily Compliance News to put together a summary at week's end so that every compliance professional can catch up on the news quite quickly. So I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review to this new podcast addition to the Compliance Podcast Network family, 10 for 10. If you've got an idea for a podcast, I'd love to hear from you. I start many shows based upon ideas from listeners. So give me a shout. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. 10 for 10 is a proud member of the Compliance Podcast Network.